Yeah, that was oldest son's graduation. That's the one they use for the obituary.
Mementos and memories are now all that remain, tucked away in the corner of Nora Gill-Peddle's living room.
He always said, and lots of people say, it's going to be an accident someday. Something is going to happen. Someone's going to get hurt. There's no way I'm getting caught up in that. No way I'm not going to get hurt at work. I'm going to do all my safety and I'm going to do everything. And he went to work that morning and he never come home, and it wasn't his fault.
2 summers ago, Nora and Shawn had just moved into this house. She was unpacking and putting up photos when she got the call that would change everything.
I had my phone, and I was texting him saying, "Look, good wifey." I had pictures on the wall, and I was texting when my phone rang. And it was a friend of ours. And he said, "Nora, anyone called you?" And I'm like, "No, why?" "I think you need to go to the hospital." Of course, I said, "Why?" He said, "Just go to the hospital now."
An explosion at the Westray refinery in Chance had seriously injured 8 workers. Shawn Peddle was one of those medevaced from the hospital in Clarenville to St. John's that night.
Got him out there, and we spent 43 days in ICU, just hoping to see him at 10-minute snippets every single day. But until he passed, and once we realized he wasn't healing. The rest of the guys were healing and moving to the burn ward. He was not.
But he fought for a long time.
He absolutely did. Yeah. He was tough.
Brea Renewable Fuels and a contractor at the refinery are now facing occupational health and safety charges over what happened 2 years ago. No pleas have been entered yet, but Brea has stressed that it's committed to safety.
The RCMP launched a criminal investigation. No criminal charges have been filed. The law was changed 20 years ago to make it easier to do just that in the case of deaths in the workplace. But some people say that law, which came out of another tragedy, isn't being used enough. One of them is Nora Gill-Peddle.
In 1992, 26 miners died after an explosion at the Westray mine in Pictou County, Nova Scotia. 5 years later, a public inquiry would draw damning conclusions. Management that was significantly derelict in its duty to the workforce. Poor government oversight.
The tale that unfolds in the ensuing narrative is the Westray story. It is a story of incompetence, of mismanagement, of bureaucratic bungling, of deceit, of ruthlessness, of cover-up, of apathy, of expediency, and of cynical indifference.
The inquiry's report included this recommendation.
Should introduce into the Parliament of Canada such amendments to legislation as are necessary to ensure that corporate executives and directors are held properly accountable for workplace safety. Does that answer your question?
In 2004, the Westray Law finally passed. Now, 2 decades later, labor groups are critical of how those initial intentions have translated into actions.
So in Newfoundland and Labrador, we have had no charges under the Westray Law in the case of workplace fatalities in this province.
And that's something Jessica McCormick calls very frustrating and concerning.
The law is incredibly important because it provides deterrent to employers. The goal is not to put a bunch of people in jail. The goal is to provide the conditions that put pressure on employers to create safe workplaces. At the end of the day, that is the ultimate goal, that every worker comes home safe.
But the reality is, 20 years later, it's still not being utilized. And it was a historic achievement, but at the same time, a historic failure 20 years later.
Nationally, the United Steelworkers pushed to get the law through. Now, the union tracks how many times it's actually been used. Over 2 decades up to the spring of this year, they found just 26 incidents where the Westray amendments were used to bring criminal negligence charges in cases of serious worker injury and death, and only 11 successful prosecutions. About 1,000 workers a year die due to work-related causes, a third of those by fatal injuries, the rest related to occupational diseases.
So the problem is there's no political will. They figured, okay, we got a law in the books, now we're good and we can move on to other things. And the reality is they really aren't putting any effort into it.
Police in Newfoundland and Labrador say they've had training done for their officers specifically related to workplace accidents.
When it comes to criminal investigations, we had to meet a threshold of reasonable and probable grounds that an offense has occurred, and that would include the level of intent.
Nationally, the RCMP says thousands of people have taken a course designed for investigators and law enforcement officials. A senior Mountie stresses that there's a big difference between workplace safety regulations and the high bar that must be met under the criminal process.
I think it's important to understand the thresholds. So when we're talking about a police-led criminal investigation in the workplace, we're typically looking at offenses such as criminal negligence. Criminal negligence, as it's defined in the criminal code, it's when there's a display of wanton, reckless disregard for lives. This is actually a very high evidentiary threshold.
Pellet has a quarter-century of experience with the force. He challenges the belief that the Westray Law is being underutilized.
Well, I don't agree that it's not being used enough. We have very clear policy that when a workplace fatality occurs, we investigate it as a crime first.
The police stress they're enforcing the laws as they're on the books. But some people say that's the problem, and it's the law that needs to be looked at.
Well, the short answer to that is it hasn't worked. And many would go as far, including myself, to say that it is relatively useless as a piece of legislation.
This criminology professor says the law hasn't really been on anybody's political radar since it was introduced, and he thinks that should change.
It's incumbent, I think, upon the government to look into why it's not working and make changes if it isn't, because it is a serious piece of legislation.
The Federal Justice Department says it has taken a number of steps, like helping develop training resources for cops and Crown prosecutors. But it offered no specifics when asked about calls for a review of the law to see whether it's working as intended and how they gauge the success of legislation like Westray. The department offered only a broad response, saying the Department of Justice reviews on an ongoing basis the implementation of criminal law in order to support the Minister of Justice to fulfill his mandate in relation to the criminal code. Back in Clarenville, summer has turned to fall, and Nora Gill-Peddle is back in court, where workplace safety charges related to her husband's death continue to inch forward. It's the third court appearance so far, with 2 more already scheduled in the coming weeks, bookending the Christmas holidays. These are the milestones in her life now, the ones which should have brought happiness, now more bitter than sweet. Nora and Shawn were born just 6 days apart and had big plans for a big birthday this fall.
We've spent years just dreaming about, oh, what's our 50th going to be like? We need to plan our 50th. Where are we going to go away? Are we going to do something? We always had big parties. Had all the friends over, and Shawn was just like, have everybody. This year is our 50th, and it's hard to celebrate it without him. It's a milestone that he should have been here for. That was taken from us, and it'll never be the same.
She believes there is creeping complacency about workplace deaths and wishes there was political will to address the issue. And if she could have 30 seconds with one of those political decision makers, what would she say?
I'd say listen to the people who've been saying that this legislation needs to be revisited, revamped. Go to your experts, look at the stats, and see why it's not being utilised the way that Westray was supposed to. It's a waste of money and people's time to have legislation on the books that are ineffective. It's just a waste. And people are dying because of it. Do it for Shawn, if no one else.
Rob Antle, CBC News, Clarenville.